Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Laji. Welcome to the next live session of Avid Online. I hope you, your family, and friends are safe, healthy during these unprecedented times. And for those who are joining us for the first time, a special welcome. Please refer to the chat box for more information on Avid Learning and the work that we do. Artistic expression provides an essential outlet to the range of heightened emotions we may be feeling: confusion, frustration, anxiety, hopelessness. Most importantly, it can give us hope and remind us of life's joys and the true strength and resilience of the human spirit. With this in mind, we had launched Avid Online in April 2020, and now 250 programs later, we can say that 2020 provided us unprecedented challenges, but we managed to stay positive, relevant, engaged, and engaging. And now this year, I mean, it's been a difficult one, but we continue to champion the arts and bring to our audiences the best of what can go offer and support the creative communities by facilitating growth, dialogue within the ecosystem, and continuing to stay true to our mantra that learning never stops. So this evening, let's examine how music and sound can inspire the making of art. The International Media, Music and Sound Arts Network in Education, Furtados School of Music, the Royal Opera House, Mumbai, and Avid Learning present Seeing the Sound, the visual manifestation of music. Allow me to introduce this evening's speakers. Composer, sound and media artist, and professor in creative music technology, Bath Spa University, Joseph Hyde. Sound and visual artist, teaching and research fellow, Gustav Eiffel University, Dr. Eleni-Ira Panagiotou. Artist and educator, the Indian Sonic Research Organization, Yashas Shetty. They will be in conversation with our moderator for the evening, composer, sound artist, and director of International Media, Music, and Sound Arts Network in Education, Yati Durant. For more about our very, very impressive speakers, please refer to their bios that have been posted in the chat section. These speakers will probe the creative intersections and synergies between music, sound, and the visual arts, and explore the various ways in which artists create cross-disciplinary landscapes that synthesize the differences in sound, music, static, and visual art forms, thereby presenting their work as a unique cross-modal sensory experience. Please note the session will last 90 minutes, including Q&A, in which Yati will be taking questions submitted by the audiences throughout the discussion. So keep posting your questions as you have it in the Q&A box. On that note, thank you once again for tuning in. Over to you, Yati, and look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asad, for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be invited to put this panel on with some amazing colleagues, which I'm also very privileged to call my friends. Obviously, we want to start at the beginning by recognizing, of course, the incredibly difficult situation that's taking place in India. We have given this quite a lot of thought about the appropriateness of our talk, and come to the conclusion that if we can provide a little bit of solidarity and a little bit of hope through art, and talking about art as a form of reprieve and optimism, and bringing some hope to the situation, then by all means we're going to continue forward. So our hearts really go out to everyone out there, particularly those that are feeling the very difficult effects of the situation that we've got going on in India and around the globe. And we hope that you will find a bit of enjoyment of this interesting, stimulating talk. We're going to be talking about some interesting stuff that is surely charging us to feel optimistic and excited about, and we hope that will come across in our particular research. So I'm Yati Durant. Very quickly, actually I'll start a slide here, that's actually quite good. I'm the director of the International Media, Music, and Sound Arts Network in Education, which is a fairly new network, of which several of these colleagues here are also members. And we thank, of course, the collaboration with Avid and Furtados to put these events on and expand our awareness so that we can talk about these exciting new fields that we are exploring and want to share with you. I have the privilege, of course, of personally saying thank you to all three of the colleagues here. Joseph Hyde, Professor Joseph Hyde, I've known also for several years, who's going to be presenting some of his research and some of his incredibly interesting, creative, and ingenious projects, also related to the amazing Seeing Sound Festival, which I hope that you'll take a look at, not just in this presentation but also later. Dr. Eleni-Ira Panagiotou, a brilliant, if I can say so, a brilliant researcher and artist, exploring the absolute fringes of co-composition and interconnected forces, that I think we'll be hearing a lot of amazing new developments from her. It's a really pleasure to see you, Eleni-Ira. And Yashas Shetty, who is you always surprise me, so I'm absolutely excited to see what you're going to be presenting and talking about. So you're such a creative and multifaceted multimedia artist. It's fantastic to have you here. I think we all contrast each other, so there's going to be a stimulating dialogue, and that's really, really great. So my job is really actually to introduce what we're going to be talking about, to give a little bit of background, and I'm going to do that right now. Let's get started. So the topic of our talk is seeing the sound. Now I should mention that we've kind of changed that from seeing the symphony, because we're going to take a bit of a more holistic view about sound and music than many of you perhaps are accustomed to, and we're going to tie that into, of course, musical developments. And what we're really talking about is actually visuality, the concept of visuality, the concept of the various incarnations of visuality as an aspect of presenting and assimilating visual content, in this case primarily related to sound and music functions. This kind of field, as several of us are going to be presenting, I think we're even using some of the same crossover slides, but that's fantastic. We're talking about a very rich history of visual music that lies beneath what many of us have seen on the conventional level, but is playing an ever more important role, I think, in our contemporary media-driven societies. We're going to be looking at research that and experiments that have primarily originated in Europe, although we very much are open to and looking forward to wider research from all regions, including India, especially those that have occurred after the beginning of the 20th century, when our familiarization with technology related to visual media has really come to age. So we're talking about artists in the 19th century like Vasily Kandinsky, Scriabin, who postulated interesting relationships between tones and light, and even more esoteric researchers like Friedrich Marpug, who a bit earlier, actually a century earlier, started to think about how emotions and sounds relate to each other. And in contemporary practice, what's quite exciting, and we hope you will, as an attendee, will also resonate with, is contemporary practice that includes things like Lichtspiel, things like animated experiments that have co-relationships with moving image. So what we're looking at right here is an example of the early 1920s expressionist Lichtspiel style of work by the animator Walter Ruttmann, also very famous for several other films that have relationships with image. Now, these kind of relationships show that that it is possible to represent music in visual terms, and these experiments, of course, were not quite as high tech as they are nowadays, but they show that there's a necessity in relating these two fields, and that there's a lot to explore in terms of what kind of symbols make what kind of sound. So this is Opus 1 from Walter Ruttmann, which I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit. And moving on to interesting developments in the moving image, animation really has become a kind of fertile ground for exploring how these relationships can change in time, actually move in time. So we're not just talking about static image, but actually moving image. And much like musical composition, are able to develop into a kind of rich narrative. So moving on from Germany in the 1920s with Walter Ruttmann, there are other really interesting collaborators. Joseph Hyde and I have had really wonderful talks in our previous academic lectures talking about people like Oscar Fischinger, and also people like Norman McLaren, the Scottish-born Norman McLaren, who, among others, researched some of the most, I guess, direct linear types of practices that involved things like actually etching onto the side of film to be read by optical readers. So thereby, you're having the experience of seeing what you hear, and examining that direct linear relationship. So you can see actually in some of these images, you can see how his techniques evolved to creating a sense of musical notation that actually made sound, and you could see at the same time. Most advanced of those are things like synchrony, which I'll play a tiny little fragment of so that you can see as a demonstration how these direct relationships are actually seen and heard at the same time. Okay, you can see that goes on for quite a long time, but it's a sophisticated musical language that directly is represented by what you see. In terms of contemporary research, there's a lot of interesting research in terms of these can be stemming from the esoteric, but also are readily absorbed by scientists, artists and musicians alike. Even neurologists and spiritual healers are sort of beginning to see the interconnectedness of concepts and audiovisual relationships of these kinds. So the concept of synesthesia, the co-related perception of two or more sort of cross-modal phenomenon simultaneously. Take, for example, you see and you hear and you examine the relationship between the two. Is not just about seeing and hearing. It can include things like sight. It can include things like taste and even touch. And these things are being examined more. Early research has attempted to kind of examine that particular example. I'm showing here some early research from Besant and Ledbetter's thought forms, which examined, for example, how emotions and even things like the emotional response to music can be represented in thought-like images. The most interesting example that I've got here is, for example, the second one to the right, which is actually a visualization of a Gounod organ piece represented in a so-called thought form. So this is obviously sort of empirical explorations that have bordered on the mystical and clairvoyant, but they do have a scientific basis and a universal kind of accepted ability for us to look at those. More interesting research, also people like contemporary scientists and even brain experts such as Christian van Kampen talking about synesthesia in a book called The Hidden Sense, or even Oliver Sacks in his final book called Musicophilia, where these scientists and neurologists are deconstructing myths about how artists visualize their works and musicians construct their music visually. So Oliver Sacks is talking about how certain composers have felt, for quite a long time that music can have a relationship with things like keys, things like tonality, things like intervals. Even so much so that it's commonly accepted in certain theoretical journals that these colors do have a kind of basis. Although in scientific terms, I think we often run into the field that these can be fairly subjective, conscious symbolisms rather than scientifically proven things. I hope to hear from my colleagues here that are going to speak after me to see what they've actually discovered. We are doing our best to try to find out what the real truth is about these things, or at least getting close to it, and also doing art at the same time. So synesthetic relationships are not always about color. And this bridges into fields that are more closely related to consumer media, things like drama and real-time films. They can also be about shapes, movement, and even visual relationships with objects. For example, animator and Warner Brothers producer of Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, Chuck Jones, occasionally encouraged exploration in the shapes of objects and their musical relationships. Take, for example, this tiny bit of research found in Prendergast's book on film music and neglected art under experimental animation, where Chuck Jones draws two pictures. You have the one on the left in the middle of the page, I guess, I'm not sure, yeah, it should be your left, and the one on the right, and asks the uninformed participant which one sounds like Takati and which one sounds like Galumb. And in almost every circumstance, those are fairly universally accepted as being Takati being the sharp one with pointy edges, and Galumb being the one with soft, rounded, kind of bulbous kind of structures. So there's a universality to the way that we examine audiovisuality. So, indeed, music and examining how these work in the brain in this form of contemporary research is still in its infancy. But this sort of interconnected healing and even some type of interesting esoteric, even classical Indian concepts such as mandalas and mathematical, geometric, spiritual structures continue to inspire composers, animators, and sound artists, including and especially those with interests in how serial structures work. So with this, I'm actually going to stop with my tiny, tiny little presentation. I hope that this has kind of set us up for an interesting dialogue. I'm going to pass the baton, so to speak, to my colleague and friend, Professor Joseph Hyde from Bath Spa University, who is also going to be talking to us. After that, then we're going to be hearing from Eleni-Ira Panagiotou, and then from Yashas Shetty, and I'm going to try to keep to time so that we'll have time towards the end of this talk to address questions, some of them that are pre-prepared and some of them that are on the Q&A. So attendees, please feel free to drop your Q&A questions on the fields here. I'm going to be fielding those, but we're not going to really be talking about those until toward the end of this discussion. Okay, so thank you very much, and Joseph, take it away.
Thanks, Yati, and thanks for the invitation here today. I just to echo what Yati said, I know it's a very difficult time there, and thanks for going ahead with this anyway. I have found art, music, visual arts a sort of solace during all of this time, so I think it is still worth doing these things and keeping going with the creative side of things, even though they might not seem the most important thing. So I'm going to carry on with some of the themes that Yati started talking about the links between music and visual arts. I've been making that the sort of center of my research for 20 years, I suppose. And it is a thing. It's a discipline, I think, an emerging discipline called visual music. And I find just the term visual music a fascinating one, that maybe music can kind of explode out of its sonic confines and incorporate other art forms as well. So I'm going to centre what I'm talking about a conference that we've run at Bath Spa University on visual music since 2009. The conference is called Seeing Sound, so it's quite a nice sort of coincidence with the name of the session this week. Can you see my screen? Have I just presented that correctly? Good. So yeah, that's just a screen grab from the website. I'll put the URL at the end if you want to check it out. I'm going to centre this talk on some of the sort of research themes that we've sort of uncovered through this event, but also some of the people. And I should say that some of the people are in this room, as it were. Eleni-Ira and Yati are part of the Seeing Sound family, and we've presented fantastic work by both of them in previous events, and hopefully in the future too. So what I want to do first is look at some of the sort of historical things that have emerged around visual music, which I found endlessly fascinating. They're kind of there in our cultural background without us necessarily being fully aware of them. I think they're embedded in our culture in lots of interesting ways. So firstly, to turn to this idea of color and a relationship between color and pitch. This goes really way back. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, in fact, but it was codified and sort of solidified by Newton in his last great work, which is called Optics, and it's the text where he outlines the experiments where white light is split into the spectrum using a prism. So all our modern understanding of color comes from this text, but it contains this color wheel. This is a color wheel like you might find in Photoshop or any of your desktop graphics applications. It's not colored in because they didn't have color printing in those days, but it does do the same thing of going around the color across the spectrum from red through to violet and then back to red. So it is a circle. But what I find particularly interesting about it is it has these letters around the outside, C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. And those letters are a musical scale. So Newton, without really saying why, actually, in this text, decided that the colours corresponded to these notes of the scale. And as far as I've been able to tell, this is why we say there are 7 colours in the rainbow. So if you look out the window and you see a rainbow, we say there are the 7 colors. There's no real tangible reality to that. The colors actually blend from one to the other. So why 7? Could be 15, could be 3. But the answer is because it's a musical scale, which I think is a really kind of fascinating thing, and has led to a really long history of people working with that and making crazy instruments that could play colors instead of sounds, like Louis Bertrand Castel shortly afterwards in 1725. But as I say, this has really entered our consciousness, and this next slide is just something I tripped over on my floor at home. This is just one of my kids' toys. And I just noticed it has the color coding. It's not, it's not sold as a visual music study aid. It's just a kid's xylophone, but it has the exact same color scale on it. So as I say, it's all around us. If we look a bit further in the sort of visual music history, which Yati talked about, then we find this idea that color and sound could be the same, developed and taken into new sort of directions, often to do with spirituality, which seems kind of appropriate in terms of some of the themes today. So again, looking at Kandinsky, Yati already mentioned, there's this quote which appears in several different forms actually, but color is the keyboard, the eyes are the harmonies, the soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul. So what's really interesting about that is that vibrations are being identified as the core of sound and the core of color, but also at the heart of ourselves. So if color is an instrument and the artist is a musician, what are they actually playing? And what they're playing is us, is our soul, is our emotions. And this can be linked to two things, really. One is theosophy, a very interesting movement of European spirituality based on a lot of ideas from India, sort of in a digested form. But the other thing, and it's bringing together two very different worlds, is the world of Freud and early psychoanalysis, and the idea that our emotions could be expressed in ways in which they weren't expressed before. And Kandinsky and some composers he was associated with, like Arnold Schoenberg, believed that music and art could express emotion in a much more direct way than was previously thought possible. Moving forward a little historically, this isn't going to be a history lecture, don't worry, I'm just picking out a couple of people. And going back to Fischinger, who was mentioned by Yati, fascinating early animator, sort of pre-Disney abstract animator, made these amazing music videos based on popular classics with abstract animation. This is an example, incredible thing really, from 1926, a 3-screen color film, which has recently been restored. But the main reason I wanted to mention Fischinger is for another idea, really. So this is a little poem that I found not that long ago. And the poem is written by composer John Cage. And not many people know this, but John Cage actually worked with Fischinger rather briefly, and at a very young age. He worked as a sort of apprentice for him. But he wrote this text, which is, I think this is called an acrostic. I might have that wrong, but a poem where you can read it. If you read down the center, you see the name Oscar Fischinger, and Cage wrote lots of these. But this one said, "When you said each inanimate object has a spirit that can take the form of sound by being set into vibration, I became a musician. It was as though you had set me on fire. I ran without thinking and threw myself into the water." So Fischinger had discussed these really quite esoteric ideas with Cage, that objects had this sort of potential vibration within them. Again, a kind of soul, really. And again, a rather ancient spiritual idea that I guess can be traced back to Buddhism and Hinduism in particular. So, bringing things up to the present, I just wanted to talk about a couple of people that we've had at Seeing Sound that I think are particularly interesting, people and projects that represent these ideas sort of in their current form. So firstly, one of the people we've had a number of times is Cindy Kiefer. And just to sort of prove that visual music is a thing, there is a center for visual music in Los Angeles, and she is the director of it. And she's been our keynote speaker a couple of times. She also runs the Fischinger Trust. So she's the world expert on Oscar Fischinger. And most of the materials to do with Fischinger are in their archives in Los Angeles. But we've also had Larry Cuba come to visit a couple of times. It's been an incredible honor. Larry Cuba is one of the pioneers of computer graphics in Los Angeles. And he made one of the first pieces of computer animation in a mainstream Hollywood film, which is in a little film you might have heard of called Star Wars, where they plan the attack on the Death Star in this sequence. Those graphics were made by Larry Cuba. But that's not what he's really interested in. He's really interested in visual music, and he makes incredible abstract animations exploring sound and image. And we were very lucky to be able to premiere one of those at Seeing Sound in 2016, I think this was. It doesn't have the date on the tweet. But we pioneered a work for a big portrait orientation video wall, which was quite remarkable. I'm not really talking about my work, but my work does occasionally feature. And one work that we did include in the festival in 2013 is a piece called Dance Room Spectroscopy, which again is a really good example of how this way of working can sort of expand minds maybe and break down boundaries. This was an arts science project. And the idea was that in this large scale installation, you could enter into a molecular landscape. So it was a scientifically accurate simulation of molecules, particular gases, liquids and solids. And you could interact with these molecules as though you were part of this energy landscape. So as though you were a microscopic atomic being, and you could kind of play around with atoms by moving your body and building molecular structures, which people really loved. It really made it possible to sort of understand how the vibrations in particular between molecules manifest themselves. So we also did that through a dance performance called Hidden Fields. But I'm going to finish up with one of the best things actually we have featured at Seeing Sound, I think, which is an ongoing project called Inner Vision, the Colours of Sound. If you Google it, you'll find this is still going on. And this is a international ensemble of blind and partially sighted musicians. And a lot of the way that they work is through synesthesia. So they came and presented their work at Seeing Sound, and mostly they were talking about how they experience music as a visual phenomenon, sort of tied up with their condition. So it's really just a kind of very brief overview of the sort of things we do, but I just wanted to sort of demonstrate how many things come up once you start to possibly sort of accept this idea that sound and vision can work together in this way. So with that, I will hand back, if I can work out how to stop presenting my screen. Just bear with me. Well, let's carry on anyway. I'm just trying to get back to full screen on here.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. It's really, really
got there.
Yeah, yeah, very, very interesting talk, and we'll continue to follow that up when we chat just in a few minutes. So thank you. Yeah, Dr. Eleni-Ira Panagiotou, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Yati and Asad, for putting such an interesting panel together, and thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that you can see my screen. It's really great to be here with you, and I hope that today's event will provide with a multisensory and kind of creative window to the world, besides the difficult times that we live in currently. So following Yati's and Joe's wonderful insight on image-sound relationships and the developments of new ideas and new instruments, I would like to focus my presentation on an interactive process between sound and images that I used for my internet piece, Web Canvas. So this work centers on the simultaneous electroacoustic sound material and their transformation by manipulating images. And this is happening online. And anyone who has an internet access and a computer, so it's like a desktop application, can interact with this work. It has been developed based on a digitized monoprint. So I will show you some of these monoprints to start with. And a custom web application that was developed in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in collaboration with software engineer Kosmas Tsakmakidis. So I will start with showing a couple of these monoprints. which I created between 2014 and 2016. And I have actually exhibited them in New Delhi at Jamia Millia Islamia University a couple of years ago. So following this creative process of the monoprints, I was concerned with how I can integrate sound, or how I can kind of augment and create this exchange between visual textures, colors, gestures, and sound qualities. So these monoprints represent landscapes, abstract landscapes, as you can see. And I was thinking about sound as part of the landscapes. And I wanted to move beyond translating merely the landscapes to sounds. And I wanted to find a way to create an audiovisual space that is directly related to the visual language of these prints. And since my aim was to share this audiovisual space, I thought that creating this online audiovisual instrument would be an interesting way to explore. So an online space provides with an expanded temporality and flexibility when it comes to sharing an artwork and interacting with it. So Web Canvas exists in an expanding digital environment, and this is a creative encounter that is widely accessible and participatory, and it's turned into a shared creative tool between audiences and the artist. So I started on the basis of the visual monoprints, and I worked on composing sounds based on these visual qualities of the monoprints. So I was concerned with three main visual characteristics: shape, color, and texture. And regarding color and tones from black to gray and red, I thought that I could find some correspondences with sound frequencies. So red color and light gray tones were mainly related to medium-high frequency sounds, whereas darker tones of gray until black to lower frequency sounds. And then concerning shape, such as length, width, roundness, the way a form unfolds into space, was considered in terms of duration and movement in the sound domain. Visual textures concerned density, sound source choice, and rhythmic variation. And all of these audiovisual relationships were involved in each piece of the canvas. The corresponding qualities from the visual to the sonic were thought of in a flexible manner, and these three main categories were guiding rather than specifically defining the image-sound relationship. So in terms of sound, I used field recordings, electronic sounds, and cello recordings that I performed. And then I kind of reshuffled them and composed them in ways to express my idea of this audiovisual landscape. So users can transform these audiovisual compositions themselves, as I mentioned before, by clicking and dragging pieces on the canvas to compose both the visual and the sonic parts of the work. One can also hover to listen to individual sounds that correspond to each of these puzzle-like pieces of the canvas. We can play it back, and we can reset it or erase it. And in this way, there is a shared aesthetic outcome between the artist and the audience. So the audience is kind of manipulating the initial idea that I had, and I find this very interesting, so everyone can make their own sense of this audiovisual interaction on their own time as well. So a few words about the development. web canvas was created between 2016 and 2017, and it was released online in 2017. It's made of 60 draggable images that were cut out from these monoprints that I showed in the beginning. And this corresponded to 60 sound samples individually created in response to the audiovisual relationships. The image pieces function as a puzzle, and they're transparent and draggable, and they're turned into HTML image elements in order to be loaded on the canvas. And this is then connected with CSS for precisely mapping images to their position on the canvas. And then using JavaScript, images are made draggable and are linked to the sound files. So JavaScript allows to hover and trigger sound and create a forward loop from left to right that allows us to play back and read the canvas. So the duration from this loop reading is 16 seconds, but it can be adjusted and expanded according to user interaction. So I would like now to share a quick demo. And then I would like also to share the link with you so you can directly interact with this work. So thank you very much. Back to Yati. I will be sharing the link on the chat, if that's possible.
Thank you, Eleni-Ira. Yes, so there's a link that I think she'll be putting out to the attendees so that all of you can play around with this incredible, incredibly diverse and interesting and ever-changing device. If you can wait till after the panel, that would be nice too. But wonderful, wonderful work. Eleni-Ira, also her work in co-composition is really, really interesting, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes. Now we'd like to move the floor to Yashas, who's based in Bangalore. Yashas, welcome.
Hi, can you hear me? All right, cool. So thanks, Yati. The first thing is I'm always uncomfortable with these Zoom talks. I've never gotten used to it. I should have been. It's been 2 years. I should have been used to just talking to a screen, but I'm not. So I'm very uncomfortable doing Zoom talks. So I'm just putting it out there. So I may, it's just kind of disorienting just to talk to a screen. I'm not sure if you guys are used to it, but I'm not. So the other thing is also that when Yati asked me to talk, we decided, I think 2 months, no, last year was it, that we're going to talk?
It was a few months ago, yeah.
A few months ago, yes. The situation was getting better, and now it's changed. So I was anxious about doing this talk. I wasn't so sure if I should be talking. And then the question is why? Why should a bunch of composers, why should a bunch of guys and women who do strange things with music and visuals, why should they come and talk about their work? Is it even appropriate? And then while trying to make this presentation and looking at stuff for the presentation, I kind of noticed that there was a thread of thought through history. There's been a thread, and that thread is the shaman is the first guy to kind of put song, dance, and visuals together. So the healer and this kind of thread, healing practices and music and sound and visuals, there is a kind of connection there. Hopefully we'll kind of bring that out in the talk. But my presentation, at least the stuff that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to share my screen, is to try and place myself in a historical context. Where do I fit in, and where does my work fit in history, the kind of work that's been done. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of works that I've done that might fit this theme, although I've never thought of myself as a person that works with visual music. I'll talk about a couple of works, and then I'll also talk about the tools I use in case some of you are interested in using these tools for your own practice, because they're not hard. Most of them are free and open source, so you can use these tools. So what I'm going to do is kind of put all these things together, and let's see where it goes. I'm going to share. Also, I've given the link to my presentation to Aisha. She'll probably share it on your chat screen. Can you see my screen? Yes? All right. So the first thing that I want to talk about is kind of put ourselves in a historical context. Obviously, we didn't fall out of the sky, at least I didn't. So there is a history to all of this. Joseph, Eleni, and Yati have talked about the history of it. I just want to go back to these things called magic lanterns. They're kind of interesting. They come from the Middle Ages, probably during the Renaissance. The interesting thing about magic lanterns is that they were connected to witchcraft and alchemy. And this is a recurring theme, right? The idea of witchcraft, that you're messing around with spirits, the idea of alchemy, the idea of magic. All of this is connected to the works of contemporary artists as well. So this is why I thought it's important for me to come out and talk. It's important to attend this talk, because there is an element of mysticism and alchemy and witchcraft and things like that. But I'd like to go back a little more to the idea of the gesture in dance, right? And as an Indian, we're all kind of familiar with this idea that a gesture represents sound in dance. For example, a mudra in Bharatanatyam represents dance, right? So, represents dance and then represents a sound. So then we go back a little bit more. This is a shaman from Mongolia. So the dance, the drumming, and music. So this dance is obviously a visual representation of music, right? These are dancers from Sri Lanka. So there is an ancient history. It's not that technology obviously enables you to do cool things, but there's still an ancient human practice of trying to visualize music. So this is an ancient practice, right? And dance is obviously the first manifestation of this practice. So there have been a lot of experiments in Europe. Scriabin, obviously the guy that's been talked about the most. So his idea was you have a pitch and there's a color to this pitch. And you can criticize this by saying that this is subjective. Everyone does not have the same notion of color. Why should it be attributed to a particular pitch, right? So this is the most obvious criticism. Scriabin came up with a lot of answers to this criticism, but I find him interesting because it brings back this thread of mysticism. So he was influenced by theosophy, which was again influenced by a lot of Indian philosophy. So there you have this thread again, right? One person that I think is important and someone that should be mentioned is Mary Ellen Booth. And I think her work is important because as a woman, her work was overlooked, which is the fate of a lot of pioneering women who worked with technology, who worked with the music. Their works were overlooked. So one of the things that she was looking at is a complete abstract representation of music with visuals. And so she built a lot of devices in order to experiment with this. Can you hear? That was just a short clip. Len Lai, the Australian artist, another huge figure in visual music. So the interesting thing about all of these artists is their work was completely ignored for a very long time. And Len Lai was from New Zealand. He also built a lot of amazing sculptures that are kind of scattered around New Zealand. One of my personal inspirations have been the Whitney brothers, two brothers, John and James. Interesting fellows because in their garage in the 60s, they built their own computers out of junk to visualize music. And they're interesting because not only did they do these amazing experiments with computers, they were also deeply influenced by Indian philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and especially Buddhism and mandalas and so on. Just a short clip. Remember, this is the 60s and the 70s when there were no computers. Yeah, you can, I've shared this link so you can go through these links in your free time. I'll talk a bit more about how I came into this. Again, as I said, I don't consider myself as a person that works with visual music full time, but one of the reasons I'm guessing Yati asked me to talk to you is because I've spent about 15 years working with scientists. And the work that I'm going to talk about next and the work that I'm going to show you is a work that I did for about 5 years. I collaborated with a meteorologist from the Stockholm Environment Institute, who was studying, well, his initial research was he was studying water tables around Bangalore. So the water under Bangalore has been going up and down for various reasons. And he was studying this pattern. In order to do that, he had to study kind of patterns of Indian weather for 100 years. He had these bits of data. And that's interesting because the British were collecting weather data for India for about 100 years. So they had extensive records of Indian weather patterns. And while he was showing me this data, it became very obvious that because the monsoons hit every June or July, for 100 years, the rainfall spikes every June and July, therefore forming a rhythmic pattern. And the interesting thing about rain is that if you have 440 millimeters of rainfall, 440 hertz is A on your scale, right? So therefore, this whole entire pattern is very musical. And one of the things that we found is, for example, if you have a long period of drought where it hasn't rained, then there are periods of silence. Therefore, the question was, can you use music to infer something else? So can music be used as a tool to infer, can it be used as a scientific tool? So I'm going to show you a couple of videos. This work is from 2006. You can see the data patterns. And because I was writing computer programs, I was using Java, I thought, why not visualize this as well? So you hear something and you see the data. So can you turn statistics into a painting? So that was something I was exploring. So this, what you're going to see is just 100 years of weather for Kerala. Right? All right. So all of these videos you can explore in your leisure. So that's about the extent of my work with visual music. I also work with a amazing German artist, Wolfgang Spahn, who builds these projectors out of ferrofluids and liquids. This is a short clip of a performance in Munich, just to give you kind of a sense of.
Oh, sorry, just
Okay, so, so that was when the hair was longer. But next is tools. The tools that I use, this is in case some of you want to explore these tools. I use a lot of a language called processing. Max MSP is also an interesting tool, which you should, it's very easy. You can drag, drop things. Touch Designer is something I haven't explored, but a lot of new media art with visuals uses Touch Designers, although I haven't explored it too much. So these are the tools that I use. So I'm going to end there. Again, it'll be interesting to have a discussion with you to kind of put things in context to see. So one of the things I'm asking myself is, does any of this even matter? So maybe maybe we can have that discussion, right? So back to you, Yati.
That's of course a grand question. Let's work our way up to that. So thank you very much, Yashas. It's so interesting to see your work, and really exciting, particularly the things about the concepts of music, potentially inferring something, learning something from the way that music visualizes things like data. It's really fascinating, so great research. And if I can also recommend to attendees, if the Max MSP is of course incredible software. There's a free version sort of Max called Pure Data, which is easier to access and perhaps a good starting point for some people out there. It's quite an ambitious software, but Pure Data can do a lot of the things that Max MSP can do for free. I've been fielding the Q&A from my side, which has accumulated actually quite a list of interesting questions, which we can't possibly answer every single one of them. However, we are going to try to incorporate those into some of the things that we're actually talking about. So the first one is actually more of a question that develops itself. Excuse me, I'm going to unmute myself. There we go, and then I can press buttons. And I'm going to actually start this with a question that I think I invite Eleni-Ira to perhaps contribute first and foremost, and then I hope we can discuss this. So, and I'm actually quoting Eleni-Ira in her very interesting research on something called co-composition. So from all of us here, one of the things about audiovisuality, obviously, is that we're dealing with a duality, and there's two things at play, or sometimes even more than that. And the question is, I think, further, what is the actual intrinsic relationship between those two? Are they actually informing each other in the particular development? So early things like Walter Ruttmann's experiment with Opus 1 is more or less a visualization of music, and sometimes it goes opposite, like a visualization of data through music. But what I'm really curious to explore is what happens when they're both contributing at the same time to generate something together. It's called co-composition. So starting with Eleni-Ira, what do you think about this? Does co-composition actually exist, or is this kind of a perhaps an impossibility in certain extents?
Thank you, Yati, for the reference and for the question. To me, I think it's co-composition is about not only the one informing the other, but a process of a joint composition. So we kind of bring elements from the compositional process of music and the compositional process of, for example, sculpture or any other visual art form. So for me, it was mainly not just navigating the different visual and sonic qualities, but also the making process. I can speak more. I don't know if.
Oh, I was going to sort of toss that over to Joseph.
Yeah.
You've had an extensive experience with dealing with lots and lots of different sound artists, and many different forms in which they contribute. So, what do you think about co-composition?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's kind of at the core of this whole thing for me, because if you're going to make a multimedia work like some of the pieces I've made, and I guess other people in this discussion, again, you need to sort of ask why, in a sense, in that there are lots of great visual artists out there. There are lots of other people you could work with. So to attempt to do the visual side of things yourself as a musician, or perhaps the other way around if you're a visual artist, is perhaps a bit crazy. But I do think there's a certain magic that happens if the same mind and the same kind of creative ideas are applied both to sound and to image. And that can sometimes compensate, I think, for, maybe less skill in the discipline that you're not used to. And maybe doing things differently. I've sometimes had people say they enjoy my visual work because it's quite different to what a visual artist might do. It is limited in lots of ways, but it's musical, I suppose, or it's got that perspective to it.
Joseph, I remember us discussing in some of the panels in Seeing Sound even this year, and I believe the last iteration, which was 2018, and particularly you had your key speaker at that time was Derek Holzer, I remember,
yeah,
who is doing some amazing work with vector synthesis. And a few words that kept coming up related to co-composition were actually quite interesting. And I'm inviting all of you to kind of chime in on this. The word is arbitrary. So we have so Nitin sends a question actually and asks about the relationship. Sort of recognizes the relationship between sound and visual is probably for this person lucid, but also in times arbitrary. Now, are we searching for a liberation from this arbitrary relationships, or are we fine with things just existing side by side?
I mean, I think most of these relationships are arbitrary to an extent, and it's something I really glossed over with my talk. You alluded to it, that there are actually many different versions of the color pitch thing, for instance, and it's very hard to find any scientific basis. So it feels like a search. But also I have been doing some research on this recently for something I've been writing, and a lot of the people associated with these ideas really recognize that much more than we give them credit for. So Kandinsky, for instance, is associated with color and pitch, but he never actually talks about that. He tends to equate it to timbre, really. So he says a certain sound will have a color quality. And that actually makes much more sense. And timbre and tone and color are very similar words anyway that we apply. So I think these things are arbitrary and subtle, but they're still worth exploring, I think.
Moving on, actually, to another series of questions. Actually, Yashas, I want to get you involved here because I'm always excited to see the incredible gizmos that you and your workmates are all inventing and creating and developing. And you know, there's a big history of the development of devices. I've got here, for example, the illustrious ANS synthesizer that was named after Scriabin himself, that visualizes sound, and contemporary evolutions, things like Alexander Zolotov's iterations of visual synthesis in various iOS and different platform software. So there's, you know, and there's even modular synthesis, which we're looking at here too as well. So there's several questions here about development of software and development of technology, and of course some very exciting new developments in things like the advent of being able to use technologies like NFTs to validate those and make them actually be sort of like physical works that were previously not really possible to do. Yashas, what do you think? Do you have any vision for the future of audiovisual fields, technology? What are your feelings about that?
I saw that question about NFTs. Honestly, I have no clue what that is. I'm trying to understand what an NFT is. I don't know what it is, so I can't answer that question. About the future, I'm not sure, because obviously anybody who makes a prediction about the future is an idiot. But in terms of technology, obviously you have things like virtual reality and so on. So things that have been embraced by young people, by gamers, although the criticism of virtual reality, and I do work with spatial sound a lot. So we have a 32 channel audio studio in Bangalore in our lab. What that allows you to do is it allows you to kind of ascribe a set of coordinates or space to sound. So you can add a sense of space to sound. So sound would seem like it's coming from somewhere. In terms of the future of audio, this addition of sound, of space to sound is, I'm guessing, one of the aspects of the future. But what I've noticed is that, again, musicians, for example, have a great bit of difficulty in kind of spatializing sound. You know, you're playing your piano, you know where the sound is coming from. You play a violin, you know where the sound is coming from. Why should you add a sense of space to it? And the people that are comfortable doing this are people with backgrounds in theater, for example, or film. They're more comfortable with adding a notion of space to sound, and musicians are not. So I'm guessing the future will be where musicians maybe collaborate with architects or with people from theater, film, so that they understand that sound can have a spatial aspect to it. With regard to NFTs, I think the future, again, I'm not sure what an NFT is, but the future is distribution. So NFT is a form of distribution. I think that is an important thing to think about if you're a musician. How will you distribute your work? right?
Yeah.
What format is your work going to take to reach an audience? Is it going to be the web? Is it going to be a bird? I don't know. But, you know, the medium with which an artist engages with an audience is going to change dramatically. NFT is just a manifestation of that. Um, to think about that, I think, is important. So the future is going to be where an artist thinks about the medium deeply. And the medium will also be the thing that reaches out to millions of people or 3 people or whatever it is. So the future is thinking about distribution, the medium. So I think that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, Eleni-Ira, I remember some of your research into physical objects, particularly sculpture, involved a lot of what Yashas is talking about, things like spatialization, things like, again, where the sound is coming from, and inventing machines and devices that can accurately, I guess, represent these kind of forms. So from your perspective, not just looking at software or virtual technologies, how do you see the physical manifestation of audiovisuality?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Yati. Yeah, I think sound as a medium can communicate a lot of information about materials and space and texture and touch. So I mean, I am very interested in that relationship, and also how do we perceive a three-dimensional object in relations to sound. So that work that kind of involves moving and kind of manipulating the object to produce sound, and vice versa, listening and changing the position and the form of the object in response to what one perceives through their ears. I think it's a very kind of promising area, because we can integrate these kind of tactile and physical dimensions into the virtual world.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, that's a step that would be, have a lot of potential.
A lot of potential, and of course we're missing that tactile world, especially in our current era. So it's valuable. I'm just blazing through a couple of questions here, but there's an awful lot of questions here that are asking particularly about things that Yashas hinted to in regards to spirituality, the esoteric, the clairvoyant, so bit of fringe explorations, and asking questions like, how does audiovisuality relate to things like Vedic chants, mantras, Indian art forms, and things like mandalas, and so on and so forth. And I know that all of you have mentioned at some point the research that I have been doing since many years, incorporating things like the Sri Yantra and Vedantic practices, ancient Indian practices, on the concepts of duality, which by definition are actually synesthetic practices in their own right, and are usually practiced without verbalization, so kind of like sound. And the way that these practices are actually usually developed is that you have a visual representation of certain forms of spiritual awareness, which can of course be translated into music or dance or any form of external expression. So in your researches, I'm asking this generally to everybody, how have you been approaching the I wouldn't say less scientific, but I would say more empirical, spiritual in these dualistic practices, these visuality practices? Have you found them to be always there, or do you think that there's a separation between them and more scientific practices? Sorry, that's a long question.
I'll chip in if no one else is going to. I mean, I would say that in my work, I've never sort of deliberately aimed for that. It's something that I've tended to sort of find afterwards. And I find that quite interesting in this whole world that, you know, again, to go back to the color vibration thing, you know, that links to all sorts of spiritual beliefs. But, you know, one can also talk about the actual frequency of a pitch and the actual frequency of a color. In a scientific way. And someone had asked a question about cymatics. I can't find the question, but that's the vibrations produced in liquids in particular using sound.
Right.
And I'm often struck how similar they are to mandala patterns, the same with the kind of oscilloscope images that Mary Ellen Butte and now Derek Holzer, who you mentioned, Yati, are using. Where, you know, two vibrations are used to do the X and Y axis, and if they're in a harmonic ratio, you get these beautiful, intricate patterns that really are reminiscent of various kind of Arabic patterns and mandalas and the like. So yeah, I'd say it's not something that I strive towards, but it's something that I observe and am interested in this world.
Yep. And Yashas, I know that we discussed these concepts about geometric forms and serialism, and I was delighted to find that many of the students and colleagues there were taking that on board almost instantaneously. And I often wonder if there's an Indian connection to that as well.
There is, there is a long history of, for example, the American avant-garde coming to India. So, you know, all of the 20th century American composers, Lamont Young, Terry Riley, all of them had to take that trip to India, right? Now, how much of, I believe that a lot of the American avant-garde borrowed heavily from practices in India. So someone like Pran Nath, for example, was a huge influence on modern American music. Now that history is not talked about. The other thing, for example, John Cage spent time in Ahmedabad talking to Gira Sarabhai. And I have a feeling that he kind of borrowed many ideas from her without crediting her. So in terms of modern American music or modern Western music, there is that kind of relationship to Indian music. And we know that history is coming out now. Well, in terms of, I am more interested in non-classical forms now, because again, when you talk about classical, you talk about a certain, there is certain elitism. And Indian music is not just Hindustani or Carnatic, and often the mistake is made that Indian music is Carnatic or Hindustani. There is a huge tradition of amazing drumming traditions, for example, folk music, stuff that's not talked about. So that is something that I would be interested in exploring. But yes, there has been a kind of a flow between Eastern and Western practices. It's been more obvious, you know, in the jazz or the fusion context, but I feel that it's also present in this kind of classical or avant-garde context as well.
Yes, and perhaps even ever more so with globalization amplifying contact, obviously, and dissolving the exoticism of traveling into instant access at all times, through technology. So we have we're actually slowly starting to wrap things up. And a way back, someone asks a question, particularly to Eleni-Ira, but I want to ask to all of you three, as I know you professionally and also personally, as very interesting musicians, composers that have evolved with your own particular practice, as we can see, and have at some point realized that there's more to our practice than just making some tunes with some instruments and things, but that we are actually involving ourselves with things like creation of visual media or objects and things like that. And the question was actually, do we consider ourselves synesthetes? And in the book The Hidden Sense, there are some very specific or fairly successful ways in which we can evaluate ourselves as synesthetes. But do you consider yourself having certain synesthetic traits, and is that something that you recognize has been highly influential in your development as artists? Maybe start with Eleni-Ira.
Great. Yeah. So I think I mostly identify with the etymology of the word rather than the actual neurological state. So seeing and aesthesis, meaning like perceiving together, and I'm concerned with the simultaneous perception of sound, image, and all other visual kind of objects. So I inevitably I do perceive them together, and but these changes is not always the same. So I don't think there is, like, I cannot kind of relate with a color sound keyboard, for example. So it depends, as Joe said before, on the why and the how and the occasion of this immersive kind of audiovisual space. So that's my take on it.
Great. What about you, Joe?
Yeah, it's the same really. I'd have to separate out the actual kind of neurological condition from the sort of abstract idea. And I'm not a synesthete, as in I don't have hardwired associations like some people do. But for me, it's another thing where it's an interesting thing to strive towards. So, sometimes when I hear a sound, I have quite a clear idea of what that sound might look like. And sometimes I really don't. But almost everybody I know who works in this field recognizes a kind of magic moment when, however you get there, you arrive at a sort of synergy between a sonic element and a visual element. And it's just, yes, those really fuse. They really can kind of do something together, which neither of them do separately. And it's a magic thing. It still really kind of excites me working in this.
Wonderful. What about you, Yashas?
I just turned 42, so I'm kind of going deaf and blind. So it's the opposite of synesthesia. So no, I don't have any kind of relationship with two senses fusing into one. No, in fact, I think I have a fairly objective approach to sound, an empirical and objective approach. It's more a tool for exploring the world objectively. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's something that I'm exploring. Can you use sound? Can you use music as a tool to explore things? So therefore, I try to be as objective about it as possible.
Fantastic. And for myself, I think, just wrapping it up, I am almost constantly these days asking myself what that means as well, and if I am synesthete, or whether that even matters at all, as Yasha said. Does it matter at all? So on that on that kind of ethereal note, I really want to thank once again all three of you for hanging out in this unique situation. Thanks for sharing your expertise. It's great to see all of you. And thank you also, Asad, for having us on board. We're going to sign out, and obviously, if any attendees would like to find out more about our particular work, we all have our resources that are available, I think, on the Avid site. So thank you again, and I'll pass you on to Asad.
Thank you to our panelists for such wonderful presentations. I mean, you know, I think we should have done a half-day symposium with the amount of questions and interest that we've got. But thank you for sharing such interesting and innovative insights on the intersection of sound and visual mediums. And Yati, to you for putting this panel together. I know it's, I think when Yashas mentioned a couple of months ago, yes, we did start this conversation then. Avid likes to work a few months in advance. People think we're a little strange for that, but you know, it's. I think it's then you land up getting a presentation like this with, you know, a wonderful panel with such wonderful presentations and so many interesting questions and an interesting dialogue. But thank you once again. I much appreciate all the support, and also for, I mean, you know, accommodating our last minute request of should we do it, should we not, how do we, you know, how do we make it relevant? And I'm so happy we did, because, you know, the arts has the potential to heal, and which is something we really believe in, and so we believe that business should go on as usual for now, and you know, hope for the best. But on that optimistic note, you know, we have many other very interesting programs planned. Our next session is our series on sustainability, which is now in its 5th edition, and it's sustainability now, the age of the conscious consumerism, and that's next Thursday on the 13th, and it's a very apt topic again, because how consumerism has changed for all of us all over the world in the last year, and now how it will change for at least some of us in certain parts of the world for this year. And it's an interesting way of looking at consumption and self and what one does in such times. Followed by Museums 2021, the Cultural Meaning and Digitization Legacy, which is on the 20th of May. Again, to find out more about our programs, just stalk us on social media. Our handle is at Avid Learning, or check out our website. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and remember that learning never stops. Thank you once again to a wonderful panel, and especially to Yati for putting this together.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Stay safe, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.